welcome to the Stanley Street Social Podcast presented by MAP. My name is Alex Clements and this episode is with the former professional road cyclist David Millar. We sat down with David before the grassroots cycling lunch to mainly chat about two major points of how he found a career path after cycling, the effect that his 2-year ban had on that, and where the sport is at as a whole, as a business model, how the doping problem's going, and all the different governance groups and how they all work together, and really who owns the sport. If you could leave us a comment on iTunes, leave a review, and share this podcast with a friend, that would be greatly appreciated. We hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Stanley Street Social Podcast, David Millar. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
When did you arrive in Australia?
So we're Friday now. I arrived into Sydney 3 days ago, Tuesday.
And what are you doing here?
I'm here as a guest of Grassroots Sports Club, which is an amazing fundraising group, and I'm here to help them raise money for the charities that they represent, which are primarily to help underprivileged children who are generally orphaned or whose parents, they've lost their parents to illicit drug use. And Grassroots, their concept is to use sport as a tool to improve their lives and give them access to not only equipment, facilities, but social groups and training that they wouldn't get otherwise. And it's a fantastic cause.
And then you've also been out here with your own brand, Chapter 3.
Yeah, Chapter 3, so that's my third chapter of my life. We call it Chapter 3 because I wanted to take everything I'd learned through my career and apply it in a different way, a non-racing way. So taking all that tech, all those relationships I'd built, the things I'd learned, and transferring it into a real-world brand that tapped into all that knowledge and could make the most out of that 20 years at the highest level of the sport. And that's Chapter 3.
How old is it now?
We're in our fifth year. So I started it literally immediately when I stopped racing, which was 2014. And the reason we call it Chapter 3 was because of my final year, everybody kept asking, what's the next chapter? And I knew that I wanted to do this. I had this concept of creating this brand. And I didn't want to use my name because primarily I thought that would be very limiting. And I consider, as an athlete, myself to be a depreciating asset. So I wanted to create something that could be an appreciating asset. And we came up with the name Chapter 3 because that idea of being the next chapter, but also the final chapter. And it's working on that idea where actually my career was split in half by a doping ban. And it was very clearly defined two parts to my career, before and after. And this now is the third act in, I think, the kind of my life, and it's hence the Chapter 3. It's the classic narrative construction.
So Chapter 3 or Chapter 2 for a lot of athletes is a very tricky one. Like you talk about, it's appreciating brand or your name. It kind of, you finish the sport, and unless you're a Cadell Evans, a huge personality, your name all of a sudden becomes almost irrelevant. How did you go, all right, I'm going to make a clothing brand?
It's that we're often, it is that question, what's the next chapter? And yes, for the majority it's Chapter 2. In many ways, my ban had been a blessing in disguise, in the sense that it introduced me to this idea that the cord is cut when you stop. And for sure, mine was extreme in the sense that I was a prior in the sport, so the cord was cut. But it gave me a realization of what the world was like when I'm not a professional cyclist, and that happened when I was relatively young. I was 24, 26 actually. And that meant that when I was coming to the end of my career, I was preparing myself for the fact that I was going to have to reboot everything and restart. I could ride the coattails to a certain degree, which is what I've actually done with Chapter 3, is reactivated and the relationships I had and into a different way. But we don't have any transition learning practice programs in place for when we stop bike racing. And I'd go as far as say we don't have rehabilitation because it's a complete reboot, and there's a lot of mental health issues that go on with athletes when they stop. And that's one of the problems. Then it becomes an infinite loop of issues, because you stop, all of a sudden you realise that arguably the thing you were best at, you can never do again. All those years that you put into it, all that learning, is now no longer applicable to much else in life. Obvious, you have to find it. And you find yourself very lost and isolated and confused, and it can take quite a few years. I mean, I'd say on average 5 years to transition out of being an elite athlete to fitting back into, I use the word normal, but that's not at all in a negative sense, but the majority of society. And you need a lot of help from family and friends, and because the sport itself doesn't help you. It's once you're done, you're replaced, and it just carries on without you, and that's quite a hard realization to take.
So that responsibility, do you see that on the athlete or the sport or the team?
I'd say it's all of those things. I'd say the team, some teams are better at it than others. I'll give you a prime example is AG2R, which is a French team, AG Désert, in that they have a development team, an under-23 team, and in order to be on that under-23 team, which is essentially a feeder team to their World Tour team, you have to enroll at Chambéry University and complete a degree. And so and what's amazing with that is, I mean, I spoke to Vincent Lefanu a couple of years ago and learned about this. I think the 8 or 9 riders on their World Tour team had gone through that program. So they're almost preempting, they're educating you before and during your career that this isn't your whole life. You need to be ready for this, which is a really interesting attitude, and that's perhaps the sort of attitude that probably more teams should embrace, is that long-term responsibility of nurturing the guys, not only to exploit the most out of them as an athlete during their career, but prepare them for what's next. But that's a unique proposition. I think it actually should be the role of the International Cycling Union to perhaps accept and perhaps enforce slightly that idea and that responsibility to teams and to the culture of the sport as a whole. But then ultimately, it probably lies with the Professional Cyclists Union. That should be one of their driving forces, is to prepare the riders that they represent for the rest of their lives. So it's not only about helping them during the trials and tribulations during their career, arguably their bigger responsibility should be preparing them for the rest of their lives, which at the moment they don't do.
How did you come to that you actually want to do a bike brand? I guess a lot of the things that I've seen in athletes, it's like, I want to do something, but I just don't know what. It's like, where do I go? So many options. Whereas, as you said before, you've trained yourself in this one so tiny niche area. It's like, well, what do I do now?
Yeah, mine was perhaps arguably a little more simplified. And I was supposed to go to art college, and I'd written a book during my career. I had quite unique relationships with my partners in the sense that I was very well respected by these brands as being a key asset when it came to product development and working with their designers, etc. So I had those strings to my bow in the creative sense, and that was very much it was a full loop, a full circle, in the sense that I decided not to go to art college and to become a professional cyclist. And then coming out of it, I was like, actually, now that I'm older, I understand that maybe I could apply everything I've learned in a different direction, artistically and creatively, which is this perfect for me, an amalgamation of tech and art, and which I can see and still do see isn't really done in sport. And we're not one niche area. We're not a cycling apparel brand. We're not a bike brand. we're everything at that sort of level. I'd like us to become this top level cycling brand to begin with, but then be able to transfer into different sports. So we apply that thinking to everything that involves sport, but also then I go as far as say well-being. It's this concept that Chapter 3 becomes this idea where Chapter 3 is a great place to be. It's a point we get to in our lives where sport becomes quite an integral part of what we're doing. And when I say sport, just that sense of that embodiment of using our bodies to help our minds. And there's the cliche, there's the saying, healthy body, healthy mind. We take it for granted. I don't think perhaps we should start thinking a bit more about the embodiment of kind of what we are and applying that, but doing it in a way that's tech and creative and artistic and interesting and provocative. And that's where I'd like to see Chapter 3 to go. So it's quite a big idea now, and it will take me many years to achieve. But it almost then treats those 18 years that I was professional and applying it in a totally different way to anybody's ever done it before.
So you had Chapter 3 in your Chapter 2. On the mental side, was that better? Or did it improve your performance because you had that?
I think if we take my career, it's very much a career, as I said, of two halves. And the first half was I made a lot of mistakes. I was very goal orientated and goal defined, if you like. It was I judged my success on the pure qualitative results of the pursuit of that goal, and I made a lot of mistakes in the process. I ended up cheating, I ended up taking drugs. I found myself with the wrong people on the wrong team, and taking the wrong advice and choosing the wrong mentors, and it was a perfect shitstorm. But then I came out of that, and I had to stop and reset and take quite a serious look at myself and the sport and make big decisions about what I was going to do when I came back into the sport. And when I came back into the sport, it was a case of, I need to do this different now. I need to learn from everything that I went through, because I had a lot of regrets, and I recognise I've made mistakes. There's a process, I think, to this. If you make mistakes and you recognise you've made mistakes, then that equates to a regret. And if you have a regret, then a regret's a really useful thing, because it serves a purpose to learning, because then you live with that regret, and that regret allows you to make sure you don't do it again. And you can do that on a personal level, but I also wanted to take it to a macro level and try to prevent what happened to me happening to other people, which is why I worked so hard with anti-doping agencies, was so open with the media, wrote the book, worked with federations, race organisers, even as recently as last year, attempted to overthrow the Professional Cyclists Union, because I think there's a lot that still needs to change, and very few people are willing to do it, or have the education and the tools that I have to do it. But that's my penance, I think, that I believe is my duty for being allowed to have a second chance, and that didn't come for free. And so the second chance, this is what I try to do now, is try to forever. It's my decision to make sure that I pay back that debt of gratitude for being allowed to come back into the sport.
The Cyclist Union, Twitter exploded last year when you launched your, I don't know what you call it, your ambition to be the president of the
political campaign.
Yeah, your political campaign. It, especially from an Australian, English, American perspective, it seemed like every rider was on your scene. That video you did was all over Twitter. Yeah. It was like, cool, he's going to be the next man in charge. What happened?
Well, with CPA, it's a very classical union, and one of the reasons for me running for it was I recognised this, and I was aware that people weren't quite educated on. So there's quite a lot of fundamental issues, and if you go to the first principles of the problems we have, one of them is the lack of unionisation in the peloton, the lack of a common voice, lack of the peloton should be and needs to be and must be in the future the most powerful stakeholder within the sport. And if we split them up into those stakeholders, there's a peloton, that's the riders, there's a unified force. You have the race organised, which are in many ways scattered. You have so many different race organised. You have ASO, RCS, Flanders Classics, etc. But they have their own body, a race organiser's body, and that's a stakeholder. You have the UCI, you have international federations, you have national anti-doping organisations, NADOs. The list goes on of these groups of people. But one of the most interesting ones is all of those different groups manage to unify pretty well, even with their differences. And when they're sitting at the table making these decisions about the sport, the weakest stakeholder at that table every single time is the cyclists, because our union is not truly representative. It's made up of a committee of, I think, 5 or 6 people who are national unions who are affiliated to the CPA, and each one of those people that sits on the board, individuals, they carry every single vote for the amount of riders they have in their country, and they don't even poll their riders for the decisions they make. So it's basically a hegemony of I'd say amateurism, and with barely. How would I put it? I'd go as far as saying incompetence. They're incompetent at what they do, and they don't look after the riders' rights. And so I very much wanted to raise and educate the riders by doing that campaign and launching this idea of educating them on how the union works and how they don't have a voice and they don't have the right to vote, which is just madness. Every professional cyclist can't vote for the decisions that are made by their union. And so I knew when I created the campaign and did all this work and put all the mandate together and made all this noise that I was never going to win. It was impossible for me to win because the 5 people on the committee, 6 people had already decided they were going to vote for the incumbent, Gianni Bugno, because that's just how they operate. But it worked in the sense that it raised awareness and hopefully it will force change, but it involved a huge investment of time and emotion from my part, because it then brings out all the woodwork of my past and the haters, etc., as well as there was such a wonderful wave of positivity from the riders in the peloton backing me, but they were impotent to help me. But what it also brought out was all the haters and so it was a bit of a voyage of mixed emotion for me, and it's something that I'm not overly keen to wade back into in the near future.
So how can it be fixed?
Time. I was talking last night to somebody, and it's when I started with the whole anti-doping kind of fight that I went on from 2005 to near the end of my career, so 10 years, 2014, 2015, and even to last year where I'm at IOC conferences, etc. I always said it's going to take 10 years for us to change it. And I think we're very much going to have to enter from last year to the changing of the CPA is going to be a 10-year project, because you need to first of all have a cultural shift within the professional peloton for them to start to understand they have a responsibility to help to change this. They can't just let it happen on its own. You have the fundamental structure and politics of the current CPA, which needs to have a total reshift. You're stuck with the fact that the incumbent is in for another 4 years. The Secretary General, Laura, is effectively the president, and she's the Secretary General now, so her term is almost ad infinitum, as much as she likes it to be, until those other 5 members say differently. So it's either going to take them to recognise that they're not doing a good job, which they won't, because they think they're doing a totally adequate job, or it would take a complete revolution, insurrection from the peloton, and a revolt per se to kind of change it. But the problem is it's quite hard to unify the peloton. When we go back, it's the chicken or the egg. So you end up in this infinite loop of, well, we need to get the peloton together to do this, but we need the union to get the peloton together. And so it's like, well, union aren't going to do it, and the peloton aren't going to do it. So we're in this really tricky situation at the moment.
How did you get close to bringing everyone together, or do you still see there's a bit of a divide?
It came pretty close. And to be perfectly frank, if I had more resources, and when I say resources, money, personal financial resources to just work solely on that in an almost philanthropic way, then I could do it, and then it would be a pretty interesting project. But I don't have that many resources, and also, as I said, it turned into quite a negative pursuit in the amount of kind of attacking that was involved, and the pure negativity of politics can be quite draining. And one of the things I did recognise from spending a month, 6 weeks of solidly just purely on the CPA and that campaign, that mandate, and investing my own time and money into it, was I really love what I'm doing with Chapter 3. That's a really positive thing in my life and with my family and the people I'm working with. And I sort of stepped out and I thought, well, maybe if this is a 10-year thing, 5-year thing, I really dedicate solely all my time and energy to Chapter 3, which maybe in a few years will offer me enough funds and resources to go back into this and attack it properly with my own backing and with a real focused commitment to changing it all. Because I think it would take that much to do it. And the only way I can do it is by making Chapter 3 succeed. So I have the time and resources to do it.
So that whole campaign was out of your wallet?
Yeah, completely.
Do you think the sport can go forward without it?
It will always go forward because cycling it's like a cockroach. It always exists. No matter what we throw at it. You could nuclear bomb it and it still comes back. But that's the very nature of the sport. I often use the term where it's a cottage industry that exists on a global stage. It's very amateur on many levels compared to what professional sport should be. There's one team that's exceptional, which is Team Ineos, in that they're a purely professional outfit at a corporate existence and level with how they run that team. And they could match any listed company regards the sort of the way they run that thing, and it shows. That's why they win everything at stage races, and that's why they're better, is because they're simply more professional. And they've arguably been probably the most positive addition to cycling, in the sense they're forcing other teams to think like that, to professionalise more. They're inspiring younger riders to be more like them. They're very representative of the modern sport and the anti-doping culture now. They may have made some mistakes at the beginning regards recruitment, regards the zero tolerance idea, but I think they've learned over the last 10 years, and I think they are the flag bearers for the sport. But interesting with them is they're clever enough to see that the politics are a waste of time. They're never going to get involved with any of that because they're dealing with amateurs, and they've made a conscious decision to stay out of all that sort of thing, and be a bystander in the politics, which essentially sums it up. Because they're rational enough to see, well, we can't make a difference. We're not going to make a difference. This would be a waste of resources and time. And when what we're here for is to win bike races. So it's a strange one like that. And regards to going forward, I think I could talk for hours on this. There's a few. If again we go into the first principles of the sport, so you have to confront the elephants in the room is that the sport is owned by ASO. It's not the UCI, it's not Team Ineos, it's not the teams, it's not the riders. ASO own the only product that matters, and that's the Tour de France. So Tour de France doesn't exist. Our sport would almost fade away to being the cottage industry. It truly is. The global stage would disappear. They're very aware of that. The UCI are very aware of that. The teams are aware of that. And the ASO are completely content and complacent with that. They make €50 million profit a year. They don't need to revenue share, because why would they? There's no clear model to understand why they would revenue share. The teams operate at an almost philanthropic level. There's no revenue sharing. There's no revenue making for a team. If you're coming in, it's although it can be a great marketing tool if you do it properly. Generally, it comes from an individual rather than a board corporate decision. One individual who decides that they are passionate about cycling and want to derive pleasure from sponsorship. It's very difficult to quantify the return you get. And often those teams, they don't have assets. Their only assets are the riders, and they're on short-term contracts. They don't own stadium, they don't have ticket sales, they don't have property per se. It's a house of cards in many ways, professional cycling. And so they have the fundamental issues. And UCI, even worse now in the sense that with David Lepatillon, who's the French president, he really is cahoots with the UCI. He's quite happy with ASO to maintain what they're doing with the sport, because it's steady. It's a steady ship. It's a great political vehicle for him if he wants to move up the IF ladder, which is, again, you go into, as I say, you can digress off into this, is that he's very much a sports politician. He's moved up the ladder. He's got to IF. His next one is the IOC. Now, in order to get to IOC, he's going to need to be endorsed at a national level, government level from France. And France, the one thing you can't do then is rock the boat with ASO, because it's a governmentally endorsed product. It's one of the country's greatest assets. So it's a web, a very interesting web. But when you come down to it, the bottom of the food chain are the bike riders. And some people would say that they have the argument, well, the bike riders are the product, not the Tour de France. I hate to being the bearer of bright and dark news, but if the pro peloton strike or don't do the Tour de France will just find other riders. The Tour de France is bigger than the cyclists, and they're very aware of that. So it's a very strange place we're in. What you'd hope for is that ASO decides they want to go big, and they want to expand. They want to turn it from a 50 million profit to a 200 million profit, which they could do by being more clever with their TV rights. But at the moment, I think they're quite happy with their 50 million profit.
The business model as a whole, can you ever see that revenue stream established for teams? We're kind of there, or is it just going to be a sponsorship model forever?
Sponsorship model until ASO change their mind. It's all in ASO have all the power on this one. It's until they decide that they revenue. No one else has got revenue to share. This is also what you understand. There's no other product out there that could get enough money from TV rights. And also, there's the harsh reality of our sport. It's a cottage industry. They're not, even if you did a subscriber model for Giro d'Italia offered across the world, you're not going to get that much. The Tour de France is the only one where there's potential where you could actually turn it into a huge, much bigger revenue making model. Paris-Roubaix maybe could as well. Flanders. Paris-Roubaix is owned by ASO as well. But you've got only a handful of events in the calendar that stand a chance of actually being able to make revenue. And most of those are owned by ASO. So, and yeah, it's a really weird one, but otherwise it's not impossible. The Velon concept, etc. That's not feasible.
Have you done any work with ASO?
No. I know them well. I mean, I've known them for years. I know friends of Christian Prudhomme, and I know all the people there. But I've often advised. I kind of always think what they should do is increase the product. Because if you think about the ASO, what I always find always fascinating with the ASO is if you look over the last 50 years, the production values have not changed. So 5 motorbikes on the road, 2 helicopters, 3 fixed cameras, and that's it. Might have upped it to 4K, but that 4K generally doesn't work anyway. But it's there's so much potential to actually create an amazingly well-produced event, televisual kind of extravaganza, which is what it deserves. But again, it's what they do is they sell the rights to the highest bidder, the tender, and that tender, because it's a governmental proposition, is France Television, and they'd never lose it. So actually it's France Television that direct the show, and they're quite happy with their 5 motorbikes, 2 helicopters. couple of fixed cameras.
Do you think it'll ever get to a point where they see it as a bit short-sighted that they're not investing in their athletes, in a sense, in terms of their way that they can grow the product, is reinvesting back into them?
Well, no, as I said, this is what people need to get their head around. They're really happy with how it runs now. They don't need to improve it. It's the best bike race in the world. It's the best organised. Even if you go into the details, so Jean-François Pecheux, who used to be the race director, the technical director of the Tour de France, when he retired a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I'd been in technical meetings with him at UCI as a rider representative chosen by UCI to discuss about safety and the things they were doing. And what Jean-François Pecheux did for the UCI, spent a year working for them, creating what was the Bible of how a race should run, that the UCI could then implement into other races. Because the golden standard of how a race is organised is an ASO bike race. It's an amazing thing to be in a bike race at the level of organisation, the structure, the discipline, how the caravan operates, how they have all their different commissaires, the machinations that go on behalf of the riders to make it a safer and better and fairer race is light years ahead of any other race. RCS events are generally a total clusterfuck. Unipublic's better now because that's ASO. Belgium can be a bit scattergun. But you go to an ASO event, you know as a bike rider, it's going to be slick. They're going to do it properly. And so what UCI had the foresight to do was get Jean-François Pecheux to come and teach them how to do it. So that paints a picture as well of just how good ASO are and even how UCI see them. And so they're already doing a lot for the bike riders. In a sense, if you go to an ASO race, you know they look after you and they're going to make it the best bike race possible for you. And so, and that's what I mean. That's in their heads. They do things that they don't need to do. If they could just do the UCI things, and it would be a pretty basic event. So maybe they've already cleaned their conscience on that side of things. It's like we do our bit, you guys do your bit. I think very much is what they think. We organise the biggest, richest, most successful bike race in the world for you guys. It's you win the Tour de France, you win stages there, your career's made. Your life can be made by that results in that race. So they're giving a lot back to the sport. There's no other race in the world that does that. Yeah. And
they've created a monopoly at the same time.
Yeah, they have the monopoly.
And so the Giro is just that far behind that.
Oh, it's light years behind.
Okay.
It's from the outside, people like it and stuff, but no, it's my favourite race. Well, yeah, but it's tiny. Teeny tiny. Yeah. There's the harsh reality.
Where are we at with doping? Because for me, I thought, you beauty, like this is on the up. I have genuine confidence in the riders that are winning, the best in the world. Last 12 months kind of rocked the boat a little bit for me.
In what way?
In the Austria scandal coming out.
Yeah.
There was the year before, that thing with Froome. Is that cloud always going to be there?
The cloud's always going to be there, and it should be, because the moment it's not, then we become complacent, and then the cycle begins again. But one of the things that I use this analogy to try and explain to people where the sport is now is that I'm dear friends with, and close friends with people winning the biggest bike race in the world. Geraint Thomas, Chris Froome, Dan Martin. The list goes on back to Ryder Hesjedal, and they're winning Tour de France, Giro d'Italias, and those guys winning Paris-Roubaix, Liège-Bastogne-Liège, the World Championships. You look at something like Matteo van der Poel this year, who is just total outlier. Now those things are happening. That means that clean guys are winning the hardest bike race in the world, the most competitive, hardest bike race in the world. And it's happening over and over again now, which means that we have an anti-doping culture and it's not systematic. Now, you're going to have people who dope. That's the human condition. That's in every walk of society. There's going to be a minority who cheat. That's just how the world works. But what's happened in cycling in the last 10 years, 15 years, we've gone from having what was a fundamental doping culture. It was a doping culture. the anomalies, the minority were people who didn't dope, the majority did dope in one form or another. Now what's happened is we have a majority who don't dope. We have a peloton that is almost self-policing, that there is very much an anti-doping culture and a will to weed out cheats if they see them. For suspicions, there's no longer the concept of the omerta. It's a different world to what it was. Now with that different world, we then confront the issue where people was like, well, it's boring now, the racing. It's robotic. And in stage racing, I think it will continue like that mostly. But then you see last year at the Giro what Froome Dog did, and called a finesse, and that was certainly not robotic. It was, if you can go deeper into it, how they figured it out and analysed it. But it was a all-in, nothing to lose sort of venture. So I think, and then so that's one of my views. And the other one, which I think carries even more weight, is a few years ago, I got two little boys, 7 and 6, and they're going to grow up teenagers, and no doubt they'll get into cycling because my sister's in it, the family's in it, all my friends are in it, so it's just there in the background. And arguably 10 years ago, I'd have made sure they didn't become professional cyclists, almost kind of railroaded them out of it, because I'd have feared for their health and their mental health and the dangers they'd be putting themselves in. Now, I'd have no qualms with them going into the professional peloton. I think it's a healthy place. I think it's a place where they could learn a lot and develop as human beings and be safe, which is a huge leap forward.
Have they started riding yet?
They ride the little mountain bikes. Yeah, they just do it for fun. My whole mission with them is to do much like I did, is BMX mountain bike, keep them off road bikes. For example, if they decide they want road bikes, then they can make that decision, and that would be hopefully in their mid to late teens, because you don't need to start any earlier than that. If you're going to be world class, it's probably down to genetics more than anything else, and work ethic. But if they've got all the skill sets of mountain biking, BMXing, etc., then they could be world class road riders in a few months, if they decide, when they're 17, 18. But we'll see. It's totally up to them.
Do you think that Van der Poel model of progression is going to be the next generation of riders? That's just what you do? You ride mountain bike, you ride cross, and then hit the road, and there's no stress whatsoever? Oh,
I love it. I think that's exactly what it should be. I'm very much I'm a little bit anti the whole secular nature of cycling and the segmentation, in the sense I'm a road rider, I'm a mountain bike rider, and now people, I'm a gravel rider, I'm a fixie, I'm a commuter. They're bikes. It's like cycling's a great thing. I love all my bikes. I mean, I literally do mix up my mountain biking, road, commuting, gravel. It's just, they're all just wonderful things to do, and I love all of them. And I think that's a great place to be, and it makes it so, because it should be fun. Road riding, don't get me wrong, I love it, but I was a road racer. I love racing road bikes. Road riding itself isn't something that I derive much pleasure from. Mountain biking I love. Using my bike for commuting I love. Road riding is now something I only do socially. It's to go out and talk to friends on a bike. But for actual pure pleasure, it's mountain biking. It's kind of where I have the most fun. Yeah.
You're still in Girona?
Yeah.
How's that changed?
Yeah, it's changed hugely. So we had, I moved there in 2006.
As an early settler?
I was an early settler. Yeah, I was an early settler. There were only about 6 of us then. It was like the remnants, the Americans were just kind of coming to the end of their stay there. From being Armstrong, Hincapie, Floyd, Zabriskie, Van der Velde, Leipheimer, Michael Barry was there. And they all left. But then what happened was, in 2008, when I became a part owner of Slipstream, which became Garmin, which is now EF, from my experience of, during my ban of being in Manchester and being surrounded by the British team, I realised how powerful that was to be surrounded by your team away from races, and to have that kind of solid culture. So I made it almost enforced that everybody in Slipstream had to live in Girona, so that and that was all part of my anti-doping concept as well, is that we needed to create this culture outside of bike races, so you felt a social responsibility to each other as well, and you could keep closer eye on each other. And that then really began the influx of bike riders, because people started, before what always happened was there were these little tribe cliques around Europe, Tuscany, south of France, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, all over France actually. But then with this Girona thing happening, people started not thinking about these little places. They started all coming there. And the basic reason being the training's insane. The training's amazing there. The climate's great, airport's nearby, quality of life is up there with the best in the world. And I think in about 2012 we reached the tipping point where we went from being 30 or 40 riders there to just all of a sudden people just started coming. Didn't even think twice, or where am I going to live when professional cyclists go to Girona? And so now there's over 100 professional cyclists that live there. And that from last year, that's then led to cycling tourism, which has exploded. So it's become a go-to destination for cycling tourists. And I think it's a wonderful thing. It's a great thing for the city, the town. It's 100,000 people live in Girona, so it's not big, but it's not small. And it's brought a whole different vibe to the city, which is it's been a really positive addition.
How much importance do you put on the team aspect? Like you talked about Garmin all coming to Girona. I think it's something that's amazing in professional sport, especially in cycling, how niche it is everyone lives separate lives in a way. Yeah. And then you don't even do the same race program. You just all kind of chop and change and weave and tow in between these different races. Do you think having brought everyone together in Girona, did it make a difference?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we're seeing it. There's also a new generation of professional cyclists coming through, and in that they're better educated. The lingua franca of the peloton has changed from French to English. I'd say there's also a recent phenomenon of the last 10 years where cycling until then was very much a working class sport. It was something, and being a working class sport, that reflected in the kind of the culture of the peloton and the education and the behavioural patterns, if you like. Whereas now we're getting these almost middle class kids who are well educated, who have a wider spectrum of interests and curiosities. And I think so that in Girona is really visible. It's a really interesting group of people now who want to spend time in each other's company and aren't quite so cliquey and tribal and locked down. But that was all part of the doping culture as well before. Everybody, it was in your interest to make sure when you were away from races, you were locked down, away from people, so people didn't know what you were doing. Now with this cleaner culture, there's none of that secrecy, there's none of that kind of the hiding behind this kind of this curtain of lies and this isolating yourself away from people to make sure you could keep your doping secret. Now it's a lot more open, and it's a much healthier sport for it.
Well, it's good to hear. Unfortunately, we have to head off. Well, fortunately, we have to head off to the grassroots lunch now. But thank you very much, David Millar. It's been a pleasure, and we wish you all the best with your lunch day and Chapter 3 moving forward.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.